Waverly Knobs Entertainment presents the Branch Out Podcast with your hosts Evan Charles Anderson and Tatiana Evin. We discuss all the exciting facets of digital media and marketing for businesses and professionals. Our goal is to empower you so you can increase your knowledge, engagement, and brand identity. Let's get ready to branch out. Thank you for listening to episode 30 of Branch Out, the digital media and marketing podcast with Evan Charles Anderson and Tatiana Evin. Today we have a very special guest that we're very excited about. It is David Pakman from the David Pakman Show. Now, if you haven't heard of David Pakman, let me tell you, you're missing out. He has a absolutely amazing political commentary show, which is multi-platform and is on radio, television, and internet. It's airing on Pacifica Radio stations, Free Speech TV via DirecTV and Dish Network, and on public access TV nationwide and via internet podcast or even YouTube. David holds an MBA from Bentley University and an undergraduate degree in economics and communication from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And David is also joined by producer and childhood friend Motamedi. So thank you very much for joining us today, David. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And we're very excited. We are big fans of your podcast as well as of your show. We were mentioning about that, especially on YouTube, which you can capture certain clips and everything from. And you have a great membership structure to it, too. Can you go a little bit into that?
Yeah, so the broadcast program that we have, which is an hour a day, 5 days a week, that has always been free, available to anybody. It's the same show. If you turn on the radio or watch on Free Speech TV or listen to our podcast, it's the same 1 hour show. It always has been free. It always will be free. And what we offer to people who want to support the production of the show is something called the membership program. And one of the benefits of that is we have additional content, which is just for paid subscribers. So some people call this a freemium model, where the main content is free, but there's also premium content at a cost. And it comes with other member benefits. You get a commercial-free podcast feed and a commercial-free TV show instead of watching short, chopped-up clips on YouTube and a whole list of other things. But the general concept is we want as many people as possible to either watch or listen to the show. So we would never start charging for that. But the idea is to get the portion of our audience that's engaged enough to say, this is worth supporting, and give them something extra above and beyond what we already distribute for free.
That's excellent. That's a great way of expanding your market, getting people involved and letting them know more about you, which is really nice.
There are some podcasts which have tried just charging for the podcast, right? So there's essentially nothing free. Maybe there's a 5, 10, or 15-minute sample, but the podcast is paid for, and it works for some people. For most people, it does not work. You really have to have a very, very large following, usually on another platform, when you jump to an exclusively paid podcast for that to work. I've seen some people who were not in that position try it, and it literally went nowhere for them. So, our goal is maximum distribution, and we have other ways of monetizing the free content anyway. So there's really no win in my mind in restricting the audience for that broadcast show.
Now, originally you started with a radio show in Northampton, and now you're nationally syndicated. So give us a sense of that journey. Where did the interest for media come from? What do you feel was the driving force that got you to where you are currently in your career?
Well, I was always interested in media, and early in my first couple years doing my bachelor's degree at the University of Massachusetts, I started to really learn a lot in the communication department about how media is structured and what are the forces that influence what we see on TV and radio, but sometimes, more interestingly, what we don't see. So I had this sort of generally growing interest in media. And then while I was doing an internship with the Media Education Foundation during my junior year at UMass, they helped to start a nonprofit radio station called Valley Free Radio, WXOJ, in Northampton, Massachusetts. And at the time, it was a wide open schedule, right? I mean, they had no shows. It was a brand new community radio station. So I was able to, with no experience or clue about what I was doing whatsoever, slide in and for $25 a year, my volunteer membership fee, be assigned a time slot, which is crazy because most of the time you have to be hired at a radio station. And this was an opportunity to do community radio, and it just seemed like a great opportunity. And as far as the subject matter, I've always been into sports, but not enough to do like a sports radio show. So that wasn't appealing. I didn't want to just be a DJ and play music. So the sort of natural direction was politics, which is something I'd been interested in already, grew up in a very political family and always around it. So it became something to just sort of try as a somewhat bored college junior. And from there, it went into offering the show to other stations, and initially just one or two other stations picked up the show, and eventually over, a 9-year period growing into what it is today.
Now, your show, too, is known for having very diverse guests. People from left wing, right wing, people who have been, noted as maybe Islamophobic or homophobic or anything else, just a really well diverse group of people. What drove you to decide, I'm going to get that kind of diversity involved in my show rather than just kind of clinching to what people would typically consider safe?
Yeah, the safe on this type of show that I do is, generally speaking, like political consultants, candidates, elected officials, and to be quite honest, those interviews are the ones that typically do the least well with my audience. There's rarely news broken in that type of interview, and we were never quite big enough to really get serious presidential candidates or that type of thing. So a more interesting direction to me was to explore other types of guests. So you mentioned extremists and people with outrageous beliefs that are pretty vile in many cases. I've always been interested in, I grew up in a household that was political but pretty moderate. So it's hard to imagine to me how somebody would, at the age of 18 or 20 or 25 or whatever, find themselves holding outrageous extreme beliefs. So I'm sort of interested in how is that cultivated. And, with the example of the Westboro Baptist Church, we find out it's cultivated from a pretty young age, right? There's nothing natural about incredibly bigoted or extremist beliefs. You sort of have to be taught them by someone. Rarely do you come across and say, it seems obvious to me that racism is a natural belief. So that type of guest was always really interesting. But also professors, experts in science in different fields. We've interviewed Neil deGrasse Tyson, the host of Cosmos, many times, 3 or 4 times. We've had professors on who are experts in everything from gambling to, using algae as an alternative source for oil to stop having to drill for it. It really, with over nearly 600 interviews we've done at this point. We just recently counted. So it's been a pretty diverse list, as you mentioned.
I think that's fantastic, and it's a great way of educating people. I feel like there is an audience out there who is very hungry for information and for something that just isn't being provided to them by, if you will, mainstream media, MSNBC or what have you. And I think what excites me is to have a show like yours out there where you're willing to cover these topics and go into, say, the psychology of people's thought processes or, the new kind of scientific revolutions that are happening, but we easily overlook it because it's not right in front of us every single day.
Yeah, and the downside to doing what we do and having such guest diversity is a lot of the guests will not appeal to everybody. And we get a lot of emails from people who say, 3 out of your 5 guests a week, I'm just not that interested in, and I skip over it. And that's okay, right? Because the guest is just about a quarter of each show, and hopefully there is something for everyone. And I totally get that. There are times when there are sort of 4 types of programs like mine, and they can be topic-driven, guest-driven, caller-driven, or host-driven. And the guest-driven shows, which are back-to-back-to-back-to-back guests, if you don't have the exact right selection of guests for the audience, you do risk alienating a lot of people, and that's why we've chosen to make the guest portion just about a quarter of our show rather than the whole thing.
And you can't please everyone all the time.
You can't, and that's something I had to learn pretty early on. When the show first started, it was an opinion show in theory, but my opinions were all right in the middle, right? It was just sort of like, well, on the one hand, this is my tendency, but at the same time, I can kind of see how one would look at it and come away with this. And it's very, very boring, and I was sort of scared of really taking very defined positions because I was worried about hate mail, which is sort of funny to think about now, right? We get so much hate mail, thousands and thousands of YouTube comments a day and emails. We've turned the hate mail into a segment. Every Wednesday we have a professional voiceover artist who voices over in a sort of dramatic announcer voice hate mail that we get. At the very beginning I was sort of afraid, imagine if people don't like what I say and they email me something nasty. And getting over that was good, and it's really led to me just saying, I'm going to do the show the way I want to do it, the way the positions resonate with me. Not everybody will agree with me, even people that often typically agree with me, and that it's just going to have to be okay because it doesn't really make sense to do it any other way.
And you've had amazing growth, as you mentioned, too, in the type of people you've had on your show, for instance. And now we did come across an article that you had on MassLive.com back in 2010, where you said your goal originally was to be on 100 stations and to eventually have a daily show, which, now you've made it to having a weekly 5-day show, and you even have a much larger media impact with the reach even out in Sweden, of all places. Now, a lot of this has been carried on your shoulders as well as Lewis's. So what kind of core marketing efforts have you utilized that seem to be the largest kind of impact within your industry, and why do you feel like that has an impact the way it does?
The biggest single change or sort of decision, so to step back, running a show like this is sort of, you make tons of decisions every single day, and most of them are pretty little individually, but they have a sort of big cumulative effect. So years ago, we decided, okay, we're going to commit to Facebook and Twitter. We're going to be engaged there. We're going to publish our content there. We'll do our best to respond to people and really create a community. And on no particular day did our Facebook or Twitter followings grow drastically, but it was sort of making that commitment to engage with those platforms every day, where now we have 50,000 people following our Facebook page, and between our multiple Twitter accounts, close to 100,000 people there. And now we tweet anything out and we instantly get feedback from people. I was just tweeting with Roseanne Barr today, who is on Twitter and engages with our show. And there's all sorts of things that have happened. There was no single day where we said, okay, now Twitter is really doing something for us, right? It's sort of every day you're growing it a little bit. So generally, there's no major decision where from one day to another has this huge impact. The exception to that would be when we decided to make what was a radio and an audio podcast a video program. And that opened up the YouTube platform, which is huge, over 223,000 subscribers as of today. Public access television, eventually getting us on Free Speech TV, which now broadcasts. They used to put us on Saturday, 2 a.m. for an hour, and now we're their 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific time daily show. So that's sort of the big change. Didn't happen the day we started doing video, although it was a very big change. We now had to edit not only an audio but also a video show. But the big change was all that was opened up to us by making that decision.
And, you're one of the only shows I've seen, too, that actually utilize Reddit. How did you decide to go that route, and what kind of results have you seen from it?
Using Reddit has led to mixed results, I guess I would say, which is probably what most people would tell you about their experience on Reddit. Yeah, at a certain point, I realized that when we had viral videos that made it to the front page of Reddit, the traffic impact was huge viral impact. So that sort of confirmed to me that there is a large audience there. And so then some viewers approached me and said, we would like to create a David Pakman Show subreddit, and we'll, sort of curate it and moderate your content. You can be a moderator, so we can call it the official subreddit of the David Pakman Show. It's still not huge. It only has about 1,500 subscribers, which in the grand scheme of our platforms is really tiny, but it has a relatively high level of engagement, which I'm also finding is the case with Instagram. I only have 2,100 followers on Instagram, but sometimes I'll get a 10% response rate on Instagram, which is orders of magnitude bigger than Facebook or Twitter. So it's interesting. There's a lot of trolling on Reddit. There's a lot of just nonsense even on our own subreddit. And our policy, generally speaking, is when there's no personal attacks or threats, even if there's nonsense content or trolling or whatever, we just sort of leave it. And most communities have a pretty good system of upvoting, downvoting, liking, reporting, that it'll just sort of sort itself out.
And, a couple of the political parties now have talked about, hiring trolls or, having people trolling out there now. Have you come across an influx of trolls since kind of this whole campaign and these runs have been going?
So the sort of Trump people and the Bernie people, interestingly enough, both have very significant aggressive online presences. And I'll sort of give you, there's two sort of umbrellas that these fall under. At a certain point, anything we started doing related to Trump almost instantly received a ton of downvotes, both on Reddit and on YouTube, just a ton, even if it's relatively straightforward stuff, Trump hires Ben Carson to help him pick a VP, or something like that. Of course, we're critical of the entire idea of having Ben Carson help you do anything in the segment, but we are reporting the truth. That did happen. And instantly, 20, 30, 40, 50% of the upvotes, downvotes, or downvotes, which is very, very high on our channel. And anything we do on Trump, huge negative feedback no matter what it is. When we started saying, and I've been very clear on my show, I voted for Bernie Sanders here in Massachusetts, and I believe he was, he is in until the convention, but effectively I think that this thing is over. The math of it, a lot of people would get very angry with me, and it was the same sort of that if Bernie Sanders doesn't win, he won't win, or how dare I suggest that the math may be turning in Hillary's favor. And I thought that was sort of unproductive as well. I don't care so much about the Trump trolls. Those aren't the people that I'm appealing to politically, but the sort of infighting that developed with the Bernie people and the Hillary people during really the middle of the campaign was disappointing, I guess, to say the least.
I definitely respect that wholly, because I've seen that too, and especially with all the different articles that have come out. Even in the very beginning when Bernie started to rise, you already started to see this kind of division between the party, and it's sad. I mean, people go, well, you're the reason why we have problems, and they point out and go, well, you're the reason why we have problems, and there really isn't anything constructive coming out of it.
Yeah, in many cases there isn't. And, I think the best way for the Bernie Sanders movement to endure would be to have people that are sort of thinking through the issue as it exists rather than as they wish for it to exist. And at a certain point, there will have to be a decision made by Bernie Sanders supporters as to who will they vote for in November, in the same way that the Republicans who are saying they don't want Trump will have to make a decision. Any Republican who doesn't vote for Trump in November is effectively going to be helping Hillary Clinton. And any Bernie supporter who doesn't vote for Hillary Clinton in November is in practice going to be helping Donald Trump. We can have very good conversations about, well, what about taking a step back to maybe in the future take more steps forward? Or what about the idea of burn down the whole thing so that then we can rebuild it in 4 years? Those are legitimate things to talk about, but at a certain point you'll have to cast a vote, and your vote is either going to help or hurt the people that are running.
At least each campaign is devoted to creating jobs. For example, trolls, right? Like, I'd like to see that job posting. Seeking trolls, compensation, tremendous.
We've kind of delved into the idea or the power of utilizing social media, especially with your brand, and then also YouTube once you expanded into video. But are there any theories or any kind of concepts that you see developing that could be really strong for digital media going forward?
There's a lot going on right now with the new live social platforms, so Facebook Live as well as YouTube Live, which has been around for a very long time, but it seems to be sort of used in a sort of more Insta-blogger sort of way right now. I think that that's interesting, and we haven't really delved too much into that. And what I think that points to is sort of the big opportunity, which is reporting from areas, places, events where you don't typically see reporting. And this is sort of like a systemic issue with corporate media, as I call it, which is why are we hearing from the Pentagon multiple times a week or a day on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News? It's not necessarily because there's news from the Pentagon that's that worthwhile every single day, but it's because most of those channels have a Pentagon correspondent, they have cameras there, and they are already there. There's very interesting stories from all over the country and in schools or in pharmaceutical companies or wherever, vertical farms, but those are places that require more effort to get cameras and to get reporters, et cetera. So I think the sort of democratization of media through some of these new technologies, smartphones, Facebook Live, et cetera, that I think big picture is the opportunity to do something different.
So in the early 2000s, when you first came onto the scene, there was a ton of political shows already out there. So as the youngest nationally syndicated political host at the age of 21, what kind of reactions did you receive from the industry or even your audience? Was there even a struggle there? How did you overcome those challenges?
Well, I think inherently it was a struggle because I was starting a show from zero and it was unknown. So the struggle, you don't need individuals to place roadblocks for you. There's sort of this inherent barrier that you need to break, which is I need to build an audience. I need to get people listening or watching or whatever it is. There wasn't anything specific. I mean, of course, when you look at our hate mail, there's all sorts of critiques, and some of them were that I either am too young or look too young to be credible. And, that's fine. There's all sorts of critiques, and I don't think that those are substantive particularly. I think the real difference was, and this sort of gets to my interest in the business that I'm in addition to just the program as a sort of idea and activism angle, I recognize the importance of being well organized in terms of the business side, the social media side, the marketing side, because really you're creating a product. And there were a lot, most of the programs that started when my program started in 2005, 2006, most of those shows don't exist anymore. And it's not necessarily because they were bad shows, but they really didn't have any infrastructure. They weren't being thought of as a product or as something that should be marketed. And there are many people who critique me and say that the way that I manage my show is too promotional, and there's too much of a focus on marketing and promoting the show. And to that I say, well, show me a show that is doing really well that doesn't do that. And they essentially don't exist. I mean, they exist, and most people have not heard of them because they are not proactively doing marketing. So I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of in terms of saying, hey, here's the product. I want people to listen to or watch the product. When you get into sort of more dubious, specific advertising or promotion techniques, that's where I think there's more of a conversation to have. But the general critique that the show is too promotional, I think that sometimes people always want something to critique, and that's one that I sometimes get when I talk to people who are at community radio stations, for example. But I think progressive media could be doing far better if there were more people who were taking more seriously the promotion side as well as the production side.
I want to call out some really great points that you made to our audience. One is for a lot of people who start out, young entrepreneurs or people who are just trying to get something out there in the world, a lot of what can hold you back is your own self-limiting beliefs. And a lot of the times there's nothing, there out there in the real world. There's no real obstacles in front of you. The second is that sort of perseverance. No matter how hard it can get in the day or no matter what actual obstacles, internal or external, that you might face, you have to push through, find new ways to get around them, try something new. Trial and error always works for everybody, and really just stick with it, because a lot of times people who may not succeed in something, it's because they've given up and they don't decide to try something new or keep going in the face of hate mail or, people telling you how to do something. I know that whenever we do get any negative feedback, at least or when I get negative feedback in something that I'm doing from somebody who isn't doing the same thing, I'll turn to them and say, oh yeah, well, what have you done? Or what suggestions do you have for improvement? And then, silence.
Yeah, and I think that there's sort of a difference sometimes in the two questions you said, the hypothetical questions you can ask, what have you done and what would you suggest I do to improve? I think the what have you done sometimes makes sense, but sometimes it gets us down a road that I don't think is as good. For example, when you hear those saying, well, listen, you can't comment on whether going to the Iraq War is a bad idea because you haven't served in the military. Is that really a prerequisite to be able to analyze whether this engagement makes sense? I don't know. But I think the point you're making is a really good one. Oftentimes, I talk to people who are definitely talented or could learn. I mean, a lot of things can be learned. There's certainly sort of natural talent, right? I mean, if you are naturally very introverted, it may be hard to have a successful show where you're interviewing people because there's going to be sort of natural tendencies there. But that doesn't mean introverts can't learn to do good interviews. There's a certain sort of balance. To a certain degree, though, I think there are some limits, right? Like, I don't think no matter how, if I had decided to, instead of pursuing this, to pursue boxing, I don't know that I would have ever been a good boxer, no matter how much I practice, right? So at a certain point, I think it is important to a certain degree to be able to analyze and say, is this not going well because I haven't practiced long enough or had the right teachers or whatever? Or is this maybe not my thing? And I don't think there's anything wrong with being able to recognize when something isn't your thing either.
So for all of the interesting people that we're lucky to have on our show, we do a little segment called WOW, which is Words of Wisdom. So for the listeners out there who might want to become part of the media industry, what words of wisdom do you have for them on how they can utilize marketing and digital media to get started?
Well, whenever I speak to journalism students at colleges or high schools or do panels at conferences or whatever, what I always like to remind everybody is at no point did I apply for any job, nor did anyone make the decision to hire me in growing my show to where I got it now. And a lot of that has been because of the digital media and online platforms that exist today, right? Because of podcasting and YouTube and community media to some degree. The closest thing I've ever had to do in terms of the formal job application process is send a sample of my show to a program director and say, this is the show. I would like for you to broadcast it. And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it's no. But there's really no one person who can decide, I get to have this show, or I get to use Twitter or Facebook. And there's also no single person that can decide that my show is over, right? There's no one single person that funds the show. There's no one single person that decides whether the show is allowed to be produced or whatever. So I think that there's just no better time to start a media venture because you no longer need the approval of some executive somewhere or passing some Myers Briggs personality test, right, in order to get a show. You can just start it. And I think that's the greatest possible thing. Once you realize that, a lot of doors are opened in terms of being able to just go out and start. And you might start and it turns out you don't like it, or maybe you start and it turns out that you like it, but you're more interested in doing this as a sort of every other week hobby where you interview someone that, an author whose books you like or something like that. And I think it's also important to know that if that's the path that you go on, there's huge value in that as well. I know many business owners or even writers, authors, etc., who do something in media as a sort of creative outlet. It's not ever going to be their full-time job, and it's not ever going to be, a huge success in terms of the numbers, but that doesn't mean it can't be very successful within a niche or serve a purpose for that individual in some other area of life.
Well, that was some great insight. We really appreciate you letting that all out because that is really important for people to hear, especially in media. There are people who are just like, well, I don't know where to start. And it can be very, very intimidating, especially when it's all about, really, it used to be just about networking and who did you know. But as you're saying now, it's like, well, the platforms are out there. It's just up to you to utilize them and to continue through and persevere through it.
It absolutely is, yeah. And, the networking is important. I did more of it sort of earlier on, and it was with a lot of sort of legacy and corporate media people. And I eventually determined not that that there was no point in doing that or that there was no advantage to networking with that crowd, but I increasingly realized they were just more interested in figuring out what I was doing because what they've been doing, it's sort of a known entity. And there are people who I won't name, but who are relatively big in the talk radio world who would not give me the time of day 6 years ago when I tried to approach them at conferences, who now have come to me, of course, having no recollection whatsoever that they even blew me off 6 years ago and saying, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing. Can you tell me how it is exactly that your YouTube channel is managed or that type of thing? And I'll usually just help them, right? I mean, why not help someone if I have the opportunity and now all of a sudden they are going to remember me. I don't really hold a grudge that they didn't care who I was 6 years ago, but it is funny how things have turned because radio is there, radio will continue to be there, network TV is there, it will continue to be there, it will have a huge audience, but the sort of X factor now is utilizing online.
Well, thank you for not blowing us off. Muchly appreciated. In 2010, you set some goals for your show. What are your goals presently?
Right now, the goal is to get to 500,000 YouTube subscribers. We're not even halfway there right now, so that's a pretty ambitious goal. And if we're able to reach that, I think it would probably coincide with lots of other really big things happening for the program. And the new project now is we're starting to develop ancillary content that goes above and beyond just the 1 hour broadcast show. So we've already started to explore with standalone segments and longer form pieces that are maybe just for our YouTube channel or maybe distributed on a one-off basis through some of our partners. So that's something we're exploring. We're also in the process continuing to make tech upgrades to the show. So really just refining the way the show looks and the way the show sounds. But the big picture goal is just to continue growing the program that I do, but also to be able to have standalone content that is less directly linked to me sitting in front of the microphone, but with me in a more sort of production role. Because the amount I can host in a day is limited, but the amount that can be done at a studio that we have access to 24 hours a day is quite big. It's certainly bigger than what we're currently doing. So that's a really big goal for the next year.
That's very exciting. Hopefully you can reach those goals. And it sounds like thus far that is definitely within sight. That is definitely something that will come to fruition, the way it sounds with the amount of passion that you have for what you're doing, as well as the passion that your watchers, your viewers, your listeners have for your show and for the content you're putting out there.
Yeah, and a lot of the people, their passion is very negative, right? I mean, they're very angry or against what I'm saying. But what they maybe don't realize, and we sort of always are aware of, is engagement is a good thing. And people who are leaving negative comments or downvoting as opposed to upvoting our content on YouTube, we don't necessarily want to remind them of this regularly, but they're essentially helping just as much as somebody who likes what we're doing. Of course, if you're doing content that is just a source for sort of negative reactions, I don't think that that's something that should be ignored. We know that that's not the case, but even the fact that the content we do is polarizing, right, is part of what we're doing, and it's generating debate, and people who disagree with us are just as big a part of what we're doing as those who agree. They're probably not as likely to become paid subscribers, but that's okay because that's only one sort of part of our model.
Well, and anything online I take with a grain of salt if it is negative, just because it's so easy to sit at your computer and type a response and not really have any filter or think about consequences or really even think about your response. I've seen some comments where I don't think they're even writing in English or any other language in this world. So that's always something to consider as well. Sometimes it is harder when you want to, when you do feel positively about something, it's actually, I feel like for whatever reason, harder to actually go somewhere and, leave a positive comment. I think that we're all driven instinctually to say something when it's more negative because we have that kind of rage or anger or frustration inside of us that it is easier to just sit there and, let your fingers do the venting. But
yeah, I mean, this is the sort of self-selection bias that exists with online reviews, which is I've been to many great hotels. I don't think I've ever even thought about writing a note to the hotel saying what a great experience I had. The times that it's been bad, I've written a note to the hotel. And I think the same thing applies if you're looking at restaurant reviews online or whatever the case may be. So I think there's always going to be that sort of bias that exists where negative reactions are much more likely to make someone feel strongly enough to even put their opinion out there.
Well, consider this a positive review. We love your show, and I personally love the clever wit that's present anytime you talk to someone.
Thank you.
And for our listeners, you can find more information on David Pakman at davidpakman.com, as well as on Twitter and Facebook at David Pakman Show, and finally on YouTube at youtube.com/The David Pakman Show. Thank you very much, David, for being on the show. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to more content coming from you. And until next time, make sure to subscribe, rate, and comment. Let us know your thoughts on the show, and make sure to share with your networks. But until then, we will see you next Sunday.